She said, Tessa, before I disappear from the world, I want to see Alaska so I understand why you've loved it for so long. I'm so looking forward to that long ferry ride with my mom, because the book opens with me and my mom on a train in China, retracing the journey that she and her mother took when they fled as persecuted political victims. And the book ends with going back to that train. And there's something to this sense of my mother and I are going to take one last journey together, because this will be the last time in her life that she travels. And to be able to spend that on the slowness and quiet of that amazing sailing between Bellingham and Juneau, I think it's really going to feel like an amazing gift for both of us.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the 2025 Pulitzer Prize winner for her graphic memoir, Feeding Ghosts, Tessa Hulls. Widely considered the most prestigious award in journalism, literature, and music, the Pulitzer Prize is second only to the Nobel Prize internationally. It's a momentous accomplishment, ostensibly the biggest news in the field of comics. Feeding Ghosts is only the second graphic novel to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize in the Pulitzer Prize's long history. Tessa was kitchen staff for this past legislative session in Juneau. She worked in the legislative lounge every day, making our breakfast and lunches. No one knew she was an author, and certainly no one expected the woman serving us our soup to be announced as the 2025 Pulitzer Prize winner. Here is the description of her book, which we will be discussing in today's interview. In this evocative, genre-defying graphic memoir, Tessa Hulls tells the story of three generations of women: her Chinese grandmother, Sun Yi, her mother, Rose, and herself. Sun Yi was a Shanghai journalist caught in the political crosshairs of the 1949 communist victory. After fleeing to Hong Kong with her young daughter, Sun Yi wrote a best-selling memoir about her persecution and survival, then promptly had a breakdown that left her committed to a mental institution. Growing up, Tessa watches her mother care for Sun Yi, both of them struggling under the weight of Sun Yi's unexamined trauma and mental illness. Vowing to escape her mother's smothering fear, Tessa leaves home and travels to the farthest, most remote corners of the globe. But once she turns 30, her roaming begins to feel less like freedom and more like running away. So she returns to face the history that shaped her family. Extensively researched and gorgeously rendered, Feeding Ghosts is Tessa Hulls' homecoming, a vivid journey into the beating heart of one family set against the dark backdrop of Chinese history. Tessa Hulls, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me and being flexible that I wanted to do this in my slippers.
Right. Well, you know, what's so fun? I'm in your art studio. You're an artist. I went to your reading at Alaska Robotics. It happened to be the day after you won the Pulitzer Prize. What's this experience been like?
It's been deeply surreal, and I think I've been grateful for the fact that it's been happening while I've been incognito working as a cook in the Capitol, because it's so removed from the context of high-profile literary awards that I think I'm protected from how overwhelming it is. And I don't think it's sunk in at all.
I found out you wrote the book early in session. You're working in the lounge. I, as the legislator, am going through to get my lunch or whatever. And I think you said, oh, are you a book person?
I don't remember how that happened. I just remember we started talking about books, and then you mentioned having a podcast, and then we just talked about books for 20 minutes.
And I Googled you because you said, oh, I had a book that came out last year. And I was like, oh, let me Google it.
And I've been like really deliberately hiding a little bit. I started to feel like, okay, this bear's had a good winter. It's been a nice little nap, and had been starting to feel like, okay, maybe I could begin to emerge a little bit. So you actually are probably the person in not just the building, but in Juneau who had the most lead as to what was happening to me professionally, because all of these national awards, I was finding out about it here, where I only got here 4.5 months ago. And so my friendships are all super new. People don't really know me as what my profession is outside of Alaska. And I really needed that. I think it was something that when you have to be a public persona, and as a politician, you understand this better than almost anyone, there's something a little bit exhausting to always having to have that veneer between your personal self and your professional self. And so for me, coming to Juneau was, I just get to be a cook who likes to ride bikes and cold plunge. But then when we started talking about books, and I remember you Googling me and seeing you do the double take of, oh,
I did, because it's like you've gotten like top 10 New York Times books, top 10 NPR books. That was not what I was expecting from somebody working in the lounge. Like that you'd just written a book that was in all these top 10 lists for 2024. I, of course, ordered the book immediately. I immediately wanted to book you for the podcast. That created its own little drama.
Do you want to talk about that drama?
I'll just say there's a reason why you're coming on the podcast. Session ended yesterday. Like that was the agreement with your boss. You're the finale of season 4 of my podcast.
Good.
So it worked out. I want to jump into the reading. The day after you won the Pulitzer, of course, people asked you, what are you going to do for your next book? And you said,
I said, I'm not making a next book. I said that from day one, that this is my one and done. Because for me, I never wanted to make a book. I've always been a multidisciplinary artist, and the stories that I need to tell dictate the format that they take. And so for me, it was clear that this is going to be a monumentally epic, dense graphic novel. And I always knew I would never do that again. And that conviction really hasn't changed.
I will say for listeners that there will definitely be spoilers in this interview. Your book is filled with revelations from beginning to end that are surprising and I think keep the reader fully engaged. So I just want to acknowledge for people that if you want to have the freshest, most entertaining reader experience, you might not want these spoilers. When someone wins a Pulitzer Prize, one of the great benefits is you get this amazing advance payment for your next book. Like you can negotiate some 6-figure, 7-figure, some huge number to do another book. But winning the Pulitzer is dictating your future. And
so you get a lot of text messages when you win a Pulitzer. And a friend texted me, and I appreciated the humor of this, and said, congratulations, you now know the first line of your obituary, which is true. And I think I'm comfortable with that because I've been so clear this entire time why I embarked on this project. And to actually go back further, that sort of burst of attention and the way in which you can leverage it into future commercial success, that actually happened way back when I sent my book proposal out, because I think publishers saw the potential of the bones of my story. And essentially, just to be blunt about it, they saw dollar signs because they thought, oh, this can be the Chinese American Persepolis, which also is the seminal, as of yet unwritten American mixed race identity graphic novel. And so for them, they thought, oh, we can leverage this into money. And I was lucky in that there was a lot of interest, and my book did go to auction with a number of publishers, and a number of them were trying to offer me 2 big deals. And I told my agent, like, why on earth would I want that? I don't want a 2 big deal. And I remember that was maybe the point at which my agent started to realize, oh, I'm not working with a typical writer here. Because you're right. I was like, that feels like a cage. I want to be able to be loyal to the story and the needs of the story. And when you start merging creativity and commerce, it gets messy. And I think I've always tried to keep those things fairly separate, which is, again, why you've met me working as a cook in the Legislative Lounge. Because for me, cooking in Alaska, which is something I started doing 14 years ago, it's a way to step back from all of that pressure and get a chunk of money where it's not enough to live off of the rest of the year, but it's enough for me to not feel that constant precarity of needing to say yes to everything because I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to financially survive.
You mentioned the biracial identity as being a way for the book company seeing dollar signs. We talked about it that day. I remember when I Googled your book and I was like, oh, it's about China. And I think you said I'm a secret Asian. I think that's how you phrase it or something like that. And then that is such a big part of your book when you discuss your mother in the boarding school in Hong Kong. And it was a boarding school for I feel guilty saying the word, but it's Eurasian.
That's the proper term. That's the commonly used name for people of mixed Asian and European ancestry that's used in Hong Kong. And it's a little bit reductive, but that is how it started. And so the Cliff Notes version of the story is that my grandmother was a journalist in Shanghai, and she ended up having an affair with a Swiss diplomat who impregnated and abandoned her. And while my mother's father never played any role in her life, the fact that he was white had this enormous downstream impact, where it was the only reason that my mother was given entry into this elite colonial school, which set the tone for my existence. And so that's why I'm a secret Asian, is this unknown white man means that there's a huge gulf between my family background and the way that people read me.
I read you as white. You mentioned later in the book that other mixed race people often read you as mixed race, like they have that lens. But I'm wondering, when you were in China, were you read as white by Chinese people?
Oh, 100%. Nowhere am I less Chinese than when I'm in China.
That's interesting. For you in China, you are white. Like no one is saying that.
In China, yeah, I would say so. I think that's the thing. A lot of why I move through the world the way that I do, with such an attention and dedication to nuance and context, is that being mixed race, the way that I'm read varies so much depending on who's meeting me. And there are a lot of contexts in which I'm not read as white. And so it really has a lot to do with the demographics of where I am, what the context that's bringing me into a group is. There's a couple instances in the book where I talk about how I've made some of my friends. It's like when I meet a fellow mixed Asian, it's like we recognize each other immediately. And I remember actually Jamie Ford, who's a wildly successful writer. He wrote The Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. We were at an artist residency together, and we were walking to dinner, and I think it was like the first day we were there, and he's like, okay, what Asian are you? And it's like, we know. But yeah, it is interesting how much the way that people approach me and speak to me and read me shifts depending on where I am and how much of my family story they know.
Back to your family story, you grew up in a small town in Northern California. You attended school like as a white girl, for all intents and purposes. And you had like this old Chinese woman living in your basement that she wasn't really out as your grandmother. She wasn't present in the world. And I'm just wondering, like, going back to when you're like 7, 8, 9, can you go back to like, the moment when you felt like there's something different about my family and what's happening in my house as opposed to my friends' houses?
Gosh, trying to pinpoint that. It really, I think it wasn't until pretty late in my life when I started to meet other people who were the children of immigrants that I really felt a sense of deep kinship with their family structures. And I did think as a child, oh, every house just comes with a mentally ill Chinese grandmother who sort of is at the fringes. And I would actually push back a little bit against the idea of normal, because everybody's family is what it is. And mine always had this deep sadness at the core, which I think is pretty common to a lot of families, but the specificity of it, I think it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I started to become aware of the ways that that fissure was related to what had happened to my mom and grandma in China and Hong Kong.
And your mom and grandma spoke Mandarin to each other?
They spoke Shanghainese at home. So that was their dialect. And then my mom spoke Cantonese from growing up in Hong Kong. And it's my family's in Suzhou. So there's not actually one shared dialect that every member of my family can both speak and understand.
So I guess your mom and grandma were speaking Shanghainese in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And as a small child, like you just assume that there's languages happening in your home that you don't understand. And I know it's frustrating in the book about learning Chinese later in life. Did you have resentment about your mother not trying to teach you the language?
I don't think resentment is the right word, but I think it's a mutually held sadness that both my mom and I have. And I can speak a little bit of Mandarin. I wouldn't say I ever got myself to a point of it being truly functional. And my mom can understand some Mandarin, but she can't speak it. So that was an interesting question, is if you're going to learn a Chinese dialect in the United States, your choices are basically Mandarin or Cantonese. And in terms of what would sort of allow for the most access and utility and research and communication, I made the choice to go with Mandarin. But that meant that I was regaining a heritage language that my mother did not actually speak.
What's your name in Chinese?
Hu Renxing.
And what dialect is that?
Well, so all written Chinese is the same system, although at this point, like Cantonese has diverged enough that it's considered essentially a different language, but it's the pronunciation of those characters that's the dialect. So that pronunciation is a Mandarin pronunciation.
How did your grandmother say your name? Did she always call you Tessa, or did she say your name?
Oh, I was just called Mei, which means little sister. So that was my childhood name growing up. And it's funny because my grandmother, she was a deeply educated woman, and I think she was an elitist, and she probably had pretty highfalutin literary tastes. And I think the name that she gave me is like a very formal, it's almost like the equivalent of like Victoria Elizabeth Erminshire, something like really like that. Because when I'm in China and I would write or tell people my name, I would get a strange reaction that I didn't have the full cultural context to understand. But that's what I've been able to glean, is that like I have a ridiculously formal Chinese name. Because I remember when I was studying Mandarin when I was in Shanghai, one of my teachers said, oh, like no real Chinese person would have that name. And I was like, my grandma gave it to me. I don't know what she was thinking, but that is from my actual, grew up in China family member.
I feel reading the book, that your grandmother's 99% of her human relationship was with your mother.
Yeah.
And that I don't know. I just feel like the conversation between you and your grandmother would be like, where's your mom? Like, that there just seemed to be so little relationship between the two of you, Sun Yi and you.
Yeah. And I think that's because there was literally no way we could connect. And this book was in many ways my attempt to forge a relationship with someone who had been inaccessible to me. And the way in which I did that was as a writer. And when I started this book, I was 30. I had a background as a painter and did some writing. But as I gradually came to understand the scale of the story that I was going to have to tell, and realize that in order to explain what broke my family, I was going to essentially need to become an authority on a century of Chinese history, I had to step up into becoming a journalist and a historian. And I think all of the labor that I put towards those tasks and gaining the skill sets to be able to do right by this information, to me, that was an act of learning to be in relationship with my grandmother, because it meant that in a very literal way, I was stepping in to her profession and what she had been doing before she lost her mind.
And you made the analogy that she wrote her book when she was 30. You're starting work on this book when you were 30. Well, I think one of my big takeaways from when you had her memoir translated into English was, doesn't she say in the book that she's like fluent in English?
She definitely overstates her English.
Because she didn't really speak a lot of English in your home.
No, definitely not.
You just mentioned talking about Chinese history, and your graphic novel does such a great job of painting it in an easy to understand way that sticks with you. And at your reading, the day after you won the Pulitzer, you said that you feel like that's your gift, is being able to take complicated concepts and filter them through your comic book style and make them accessible. And you could do that. In Alaska, you could do climate change / culture / Alaska history. You could do something really complicated and cool, delivering scientific concepts, delivering difficult things. I don't know. I feel like that's the second book, right?
Not a book. That is what I'm planning on doing. That's exactly what I'm pivoting my career to. 2 summers ago, I was out in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge as part of the Alaska Voices of the Wilderness program, which I sincerely hope makes it through the federal cull, because it's a really, truly amazing program. And what happens there is the selected artist is sent out with people who are doing work in the field. So rangers, scientists, wilderness specialists, and then you make work about being out in the field. And what I ended up making for them was a 15-page comic distilling all of those complex human threads about why the refuge is the most politically contested piece of land in the United States, and how it's almost a litmus test for what it means to be American. And right now, looking for a home for that, because it's complicated given what's going on federally. But that's what I'm really interested in doing, is instead of going and reading 20 books and then being alone with a story for an entire season by myself. I want to be reading 20 books as part of a team with something that's tied to the natural world where I feel like I can really be of service. And that's a huge part of why after 14 years of being seasonal in Alaska that I'm really making it home, is because it does feel like this is the state where the kind of work that I want to do is necessary and accessible.
Two things. Number one, you just talked about being part of a team, which I think is so different from your cowboy years of wanting to do everything alone, being completely self-sufficient. The Willa Cather quote. God.
Oh, it's a freedom so often means one isn't needed anywhere.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was your mantra.
I don't know if it was my mantra so much as sometimes you embark on a path and you don't necessarily understand where it's going to lead. And I think that's what I was really interested in exploring in these 3 generations within my family, is how does the attempt to protect yourself metastasize? And how does the attempt to keep yourself from being hurt by others mean that you're encased within a cage of your own isolation? And less so than a motto, I think that Willa Cather line was one of my first points of awareness that I had unwittingly done the very thing that I was trying to escape, where I didn't know how to be in community and kinship with others because I was too afraid of the vulnerability that would have asked of me.
I wrote down a quote that I felt encapsulates the entire journey in a way. Is the only distinction between a cradle and a cage is whether or not the occupant is attempting to break free. So much of the book is you basically grappling with your mother, whether she was mothering you or caging you.
Yeah, and there's a scene in the book where my mom told me that in the last years of my grandmother's life, the duty of having cared for her since childhood became too much, and she wasn't able to touch her or hold her. And so when my grandmother died and my mom went to go identify her corpse, she said she just held her in her arms because it was the first time that she was able to touch her in years. And actually, a funny aside of why I think making this book was so hard for me is I'm generally not somebody who works from reference pictures, but for some scenes where I'm like, oh, okay, this one's tricky, or I want to try and get this right, I would take reference pictures. And so I drew most of the book when I was living in Port Townsend, Washington, and I was working out of an uninsulated shed. And so I would be wearing like all of my outdoor gear with a little heat lamp as I was drawing. And so for that scene, I actually bundled up my sleeping bag into the shape of a body and took a reference picture with my phone on a timer of holding it. And I just had this moment of thinking to myself, it's the depths of COVID, and I spend every day alone drawing my crying mother. And now I am mirroring my mother's pose as she holds the corpse of her mother. And because it's COVID, there's no ability to leave this behind in the studio and go be with people and step out of it. And I wonder sometimes what the process of making this book would have been like if the timing was different, because I think part of the reason I was able to go so deep is because there was no community. There was no outside world. So this story really was my entire life.
There was no escape. It's like,
there was none.
Today I'm going to go deeper because I have nowhere else to go. But this is the one reading I wanted to do. Yeah. That's
Sure,
like so crazy that you pulled it
Okay,
out.
so you're handing me my book and I'll
Yes,
read it.
352 to page 353. This was like, I felt like this was it. This is where I cried. This was the moment.
All right. In that longing, I felt a kinship with my mother and thought of something she told me after Sunyi died. In those last years of her life, those hardest years, the duty, the exhaustion were just too much. I couldn't bring myself to hug her. I stopped being able to touch her. So when she died and I went to go see her corpse, I just took her in my arms and I held her. I held her. I held her. I held her. Isn't this, in the end, what the story is about? The longing to hold, the longing to be held, and all the ghosts that stand between mothers and daughters who do not know how to access their own yearning. After all these years spent creating this book, I can feel how much it hurts my mother to want a daughter and instead have a cowboy. And maybe in all these years, she has learned to see the pain and fear that made that armor so necessary. Mom, I'm sorry for how much my walls hurt you, and that I could never give you love in the language you needed. I am sorry that all I knew how to do was close myself off. But I hope you can see that I shut myself out every bit as much as I shut you out, and that it's only through these pages that I found a way back. I couldn't give you access to something I could not reach within myself, and I couldn't embrace myself until I understood our ghosts.
So good.
It's strange to me opening that book because when I was done, I was done. You know, I don't own a copy of my own book and I don't look at it. So in a way, I think it's actually, this was a really good somatic realization that I think the process of closure and healing, the pain is going away. It's getting better.
And the book achieved its goal. You and your mother reconciled. You and your mother established a closeness that you'd never had before. And that's why it's so incredibly traumatic to learn that your mother's been diagnosed with dementia. Like, I just can't even process it. Like, at the moment where you guys have finally found this bridge that she's losing part of herself. I just can't even imagine, Tessa.
In a really strange way, the timing on it, it would have been so much more of a tragedy as it had happened earlier. But as it is, there's almost a really beautiful sense of intergenerational, like the passing of the baton, not of the trauma, but of the keeper of the story. And I am my mother's memory keeper. And there's a way in which, because we made this book together, I have lived her life in a way that I think is unusual in a mother-daughter relationship. And even as the person who she is disappears from the world, we feel the trust between us. And in a way, I think it's made this tragedy something richer and much more bearable. So I feel grief. There's absolutely grief. But at the same time, it almost feels like this was such a gift to finish this project before she slipped away.
Just in time.
Yeah. Yeah.
How far has she slipped away?
Pretty far. She's still living at home. She has 3 caretakers and she still recognizes me cognitively. She unfortunately was not able to read the finished book, but I think in some ways that wasn't really the point. We went on this journey together, and I'm actually bringing her up to Alaska to see Alaska for the first time the beginning of July. So we're coming up on the ferry and I'm honoring something she asked for, where she said, Tessa, before I disappear from the world, I want to see Alaska so I understand why you've loved it for so long. So I know I'm going to make you cry again. Yeah, I'm so looking forward to that long ferry ride with my mom, because the book opens with me and my mom on a train in China, retracing the journey that she and her mother took when they fled as persecuted political victims. And the book ends with going back to that train. And there's something to this sense of my mother and I are going to take one last journey together, because this will be the last time in her life that she travels. And to be able to spend that on the slowness and quiet of that amazing sailing between Bellingham and Juneau, I think it's really going to feel like an amazing gift for both of us.
I think I get super emotional talking about it. My grandmother had dementia and she didn't know who I was anymore. And that particular page about your mom not touching her, but then holding her corpse. I went home to visit my family. My grandmother was like in her 90s, pretty significant dementia, but she had her own bedroom. And I went to say goodnight to her. And she said, will you sleep in my bed? And I was like 40 years old. I was like, 40-year-olds don't sleep in their bed with their 92-year-old grandmother. And I was like, no, I have to sleep next door. But then I've thought about it so much that she had grown up in a family of 9 in a 1-room house. She married my grandfather when she was like 20 years old. They were married up until like forever. And they always slept in the same room. She'd never slept in a room by herself her whole life.
Wow.
That's all she wanted.
Yeah.
So someone to sleep in the room with her. And I'll take it with me to the day I die that, like, why couldn't I have just slept in that room? Like, why did I say no? It was the only thing she wanted. So when I read about your mom not touching your grandma and then having that closeness after, I'm like, people want to be held.
Yeah.
From cradle to grave.
And I do think that's something about the gift of my mom's dementia, because you do in so many ways lapse back into childhood. And I think for my mom, as somebody who is never really able to have a childhood, it's almost like it's creating space for her to be a child again. And I'm trying, I'm trying to do, like your story, I think I'm going to try and hold that in my mind is if my mother wants me to sleep in her room, if she wants these things, I think I can give them to her. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without this book.
And one thing I will just say that I hated so much with my grandmother's dementia is that I hated when people were quizzing her. I'd be like, who is this? Who is this? And I'd be like, it doesn't matter. I can see in her eyes that she recognizes me. She doesn't need to know my name. Please, God, don't force this uncomfortable situation where she's going to feel guilty about not knowing who I am. We see each other.
So just to narrate to this podcast, I'm getting up and grabbing a book, which is Dasha Kuiper's Travelers to Unimaginable Lands, Stories of Dementia, the Caregiver, and the Human Brain.
Oh.
And I think that's how, it's how I'm trying to approach this journey with my mom, is that she's wandering into a new wilderness and trying to tell her that she's not there and to continue to tether her to a world that she can no longer really participate in. It's not serving anyone.
So your mom's childhood was weird. I know we had a conversation earlier about what is normal.
Yeah.
The way you narrate your issues with your mom is in part this cultural divide. But your mom was basically raised in a boarding school. And I just wonder if part of the issues, and I don't know how much you attribute to the issues, is that your mom had no model for how to be a mom. Because her mother was absent. Her mother was already experiencing mental illness. She got the money from her book to send her daughter to boarding school, and her daughter was being raised by teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a clear causal link. No mystery there.
And your model, obviously, is the model provided by your mother. Do you want to have kids?
I think that ship has sailed. It's just a reality. It's something where I think part of my processing the end of this journey of this book is this book took me 10 years and I started at 30 and I am now 40. And I do think that there's a measure of grief for the fact that in some ways it's like the prime decade of your life and you are setting up all of the structures that you want to carry you forward. And I put my own life on hold because I needed to tell this story. And there are a lot of ways that cause real damage in my human relationships. And I think partnership has been one of the ways that's been the most pronounced. Is I joke that like maybe the reason I made this book is that I would make better dating choices. But you know, it's like, it is kind of, okay, here's a 386 treatise on why my relationships have been, my romantic relationships, I should say, my friendships are deep and rich and absurdly wonderful. And I'm just like, anytime I look at them, I'm like, how did I get so lucky to have such amazing friends? But I think I have been a cowboy who has dated other cowboys. And therefore, the chapter of my life in which at least having a biological family is not going to happen. So I've made my peace with that. But it was definitely part of processing the book journey.
You talk about your parents, and one scene you describe how your mother did everything in the kitchen, like absolutely everything in the kitchen. There was never any way, shape, or form that your dad was going to do anything in the kitchen. And how one time he was like out of tea and he just held his mug out and your mother had to like come rushing over to refill his tea. For whatever reason, that stayed with you. You put that in the book. Yeah,
it's a microcosm for so many things, and the way in which my mother both deeply resented the familial role of being an Asian woman, but also was impressed by it.
She pushed back on you ending your engagement because she said that you'd found a man who would wash dishes. And that was the one thing she wanted in this world. But it seems like she never asked her dad to do that. So it's like, how if you don't ask for something, you're not going to get it.
To be fair, I think she did. I think she tried. And it's a huge amount of inertia to overcome. And I think that was one of the most mind-boggling realizations in the book, is that my dad is British and he never actually became a US citizen. He's just been here as a naturalized citizen for many decades. And the realization that for my mom, effectively raised as an orphan by a colonial Hong Kong boarding school where the positions of authority were largely held by British expat teachers, when she came to the US, marrying within her own culture, the closest she could get was a British man.
Oh, yeah.
And that just blew my mind. I had to have a good long think about that because it really just caused me to reframe so many of my understandings about my family. But I think that structure for her of being a woman raised within a colonial boarding school, she replicated that in her relationship.
Where's your dad now?
He's still in Northern California. We have unfortunately been estranged for a number of years, and I don't know if that is something that will shift, because I think writing the book also made me better understand why it is that I'm not willing to do men's work for them. And I will walk 70% of the bridge to repair. I'm willing to do more than my share, but I won't do all of it. Yeah, and I'm still processing this. I've had this truly unhinged thing happen this past week where a former male acquaintance of mine who's a teacher in Taiwan did a profoundly unprofessional thing. And he gave my personal contact information to all of his students and made it a mandatory assignment for all of them to contact me in 3 different ways to harass and pressure me into doing a Zoom classroom visit. So I just spent the last 2 days making a teachable moment about this like poster of male entitlement. So it's like a little raw for me right now.
That is so insane. I'm so sorry. So you've gotten like, I don't know, 30 kids times 3, like 9 different
it's been a lot.
points of contact.
Yeah. It's okay because I responded to it, and then I emailed all the administrators at his school, and they're taking it seriously. So we'll see what happens.
I want to shift gears to something a little lighter.
Yeah, I love it. Let's do it.
Antarctica. So Antarctica was like going as far away as possible, and this incredibly unusual life experience in Antarctica. And what you took away from Antarctica was you became a DJ. And quote, the most amazing thing I found in Antarctica was a tiny room of 20,000 vinyl records. So talk a little bit about becoming a DJ.
Yeah. So to give the quick backstory of how I ended up in Antarctica, because it feels germane to what we were just talking about, is I'd been in this long engagement with somebody who I think genuinely believed that he was not controlling the direction of my life. And so always used to say, it's not like you'd be doing something different with your life if we weren't together.
Which to me, I feel like is absolutely controlling and manipulating.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say I'm close friends with this person. And he's actually hosting one of my various celebratory barbecues as I'm traveling down the West Coast because we both put in the effort towards repair. And I'm completely willing to heal relationships where people are willing to learn. Anyways, but so as an aside, when that relationship ended and I found myself able to make a different choice, I said, okay, hold my drink. And that's when I got a job in Antarctica. And yeah, I loved it. I think I've always been really drawn to remote environments. And I think the people who end up in them are people who just need a little bit more space. And I think that's true of Alaska and why I love it. Everyone down in Antarctica, you're all crammed together. It's hard to find places to be alone. But then there is this radio station down there, ICE 104.5. And if you volunteer as a DJ, you get a key to the vinyl room and you can just go record diving. And it's such an amazing, wonderful thing. And that's where I fell in love with old high lonesome cowboy ballads.
I love the idea that when you were doing these world travels, that you only took one book with you and then you just read whatever serendipitously fell in your lap, so to speak. And I mean, I love that. And I feel like that in the similar way, it's like you have no control what's in that vinyl room or what you're going to find because you can't listen to 20,000 records. So this is the vinyl that I've pulled out today. Yeah.
Yeah. And there really weren't very many of us who used it. And so there was a whiteboard in there. And if one of us found a gem, we would pull it and we would write a note for the others. And so it was like this cute little community where we often didn't interact in person, but we would share the things that we unearthed.
How did those records get there in the first place?
Okay. So I haven't fact checked this because I would be heartbroken if it's not true. And so take this with a grain of salt. But basically, there's the Armed Forces radio and television service. And so they provide media for military bases. And that was the original history of McMurdo. And so it was down there just for US troops. And then the rumor that I have not fact checked is that as vinyl became obsolete, the collections everywhere else were destroyed. But there was like a specific protocol for that. And because getting anything back from Antarctica is such a pain in the ass, they basically survived because there's like, oh, it would be too much hassle to destroy this.
It sounds true. It sounds believable.
Yeah, but the journalist in me, I'm like, I'd say, yeah.
So 2 more things. First of all, and I guess this is like that same relationship that you've repaired, you have the relationship with the guy still, but when you were going to bike to 2 different weddings and he didn't want you to go, and that's part of the book. But the bottom line is that you, as a fairly inexperienced biker who'd never bike camped before, biked to Texas and to Massachusetts from Seattle.
I went from LA because I was starting in March. So I wanted to start with less rain.
Yeah, got that. But anyway, that's inspirational for those of us who have dreams about doing something crazy, but you're like, I'm not a cyclist. Like, how am I going to go across the country? I don't know. I guess can you just give us the nuts and bolts of, if you're not somebody who's a cyclist and you want to cycle across America independently, what do you do?
You get a bike and you ride it across the country one day at a time. No, but to be less tongue-in-cheek about it, I know myself to be an experiential learner, and I like to put myself in circumstances where it's sink or swim and you are forced to get out of your head and just figure it out. And for me, that took the form of, okay, if I'm going to bike across the country, I should know more about how bikes work and being a bike mechanic. So I built the bike that I rode just out of used parts bins in Seattle. And that gave me the confidence to know that I could fix most of
whatever happens in here, I can fix it.
And so that was step 1. And then really, I just got a plane ticket and went.
Any lessons learned as far as bike camping?
That people are extraordinarily generous. And I think my main takeaway from bike travel and why I've continued to do it for so long is it really made me see that people are wired to want to extend grace if there are spaces for it to happen. But we've so insulated ourselves from human interaction in our society that it's really easy to just make snap judgments and live in a place of fear, particularly when we're so polarized, where I think people's beliefs override their humanity in the ways that we relate to people. But my experience was that in 4 months of biking across the country, I only ended up paying for a place to stay once. And that was by choice because people were always offering me places to sleep or saying, oh, you should go here. There's where this is. And as a woman traveling alone, I mostly avoided cities. I didn't bike at night. I would never go try and get adopted from a bar. But it's like I would sit outside a grocery store eating my snacks, just talking to somebody, and they'd be like, oh, you're welcome to come have dinner, sleep on my couch. And it really showed me something about what people want to extend when given the space.
So I'm going to make a statement, and it could be wrong. Like many people who end up in Alaska, I can relate to your cowboy lifestyle. I lived in a lot of places and traveled a ton between 23 and 35. What I found, though, as I've gotten older, and I'm 10 years older than you, is that it feels easier in your 20s and 30s, that people seem to have less guard, or maybe not less guard, maybe just a willingness to start a conversation. I found as I've gotten older and traveling that it's required a little bit more effort to stumble into the fun adventure with the random person.
I think there's a couple things that change that for me. One of them is being on a bicycle, because you end up places that you would never wind up because it removes the idea of destination. And so when you're off the beaten path of where other people are going, I think it raises the likelihood of those pockets of serendipity because people are like, what are you even doing here? And then I also think by virtue of being a woman alone, there's a huge privilege into the fact that if anybody is going to approach me from a messed up power dynamic, it's going to be seeing me as a target rather than a threat. And
did you feel like you were ever targeted?
I've definitely had messed up interactions with men when traveling. And I think that's something that I don't want to paint like an idyllic, rosy picture of, oh, there's nothing to worry about. But I think it's a little bit like bears in Alaska. It's like they're there. Carry bear spray, take reasonable precautions with your stuff, but don't let it stop you from going out there. And so I think there's a way in which me not being perceived as a threat makes people much more open to still treating me in these ways. And to be honest, I've had that same thought is, oh, am I too old for this magic to happen? And thus far, my experience has been absolutely not. Every time I get on a bike, it still happens.
We've only got one life to live.
Yeah.
And every day we're getting a day older.
Yeah.
I'm trying really hard to just be like, you know what? Let's just keep the magic happening.
I think we just need to throw all our phones in the ocean. There's no bigger killer than human magic than the fact that we all are now on our phones all the time.
100%.
Yeah.
Speaking of today, 2025, you wrote about coming to grips with the privilege of being a globetrotting American, having some guilt about having an American passport that's opening all borders. Maybe that is changing. It looks like we might be stumbling into our own form of autocracy as we're losing a handle on our democracy. I lived in Estonia for a long time, and I lived there close enough to when they had been a former Soviet republic that there are plenty of people who could talk about what it was like being in the Soviet Union. And a way that Americans can muddy history, sort of like paint it in their own version, is that the Soviet Union was gray and the people were miserable. There were people celebrating the joys of their children graduating from high school. There was joy of new children being born. There was joys of parties and people found their joy in a dictatorship.
Yeah. To quote Jurassic Park, life finds a way.
And I guess, like, to bring it back to your book, the most bleak sections are millions of people dying of starvation because of these terrible decisions made by Mao. I don't know if you felt like researching your family and going to visit your family or talking about your family's history outside of Shanghai, like thinking about this being miserable decades. Was there joy there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because there was still human connection. And I think community is an antidote to anything that is happening. And I think that's why when dictators come in, the things that they go after are the ability to gather, the free press, education. And I definitely feel like the research that I was doing into Chinese history between 1927 and 1976 has a huge amount of bearing on how I view what's happening in the federal government in the United States right now. And the way in which a group of predominantly men in power are trying to deny scientific reality and remove the ability of people to have data and information, and the ways in which it's being done, the structural echoes are uncanny and heartbreaking, and it's terrifying.
I think this is like a good way for us to end. Your grandmother, Sun Yi, I mean, was the free press in a part of the world where they were doing everything they could to stamp out the free press. And I think you bringing her story and her work in the face of that, and the way I interpret it, and I know it's more complicated, that you can't totally say her mental illness was caused by the Chinese government. I'm sure that there was some genetic predispositions, that there was certain factors that contributed that were probably not directly related to that. But I just think that it's timely. I see that section of Chinese history and look at our own country and look at what they're trying to do to the press, the demonization of the press. I don't know. Can you speak to any of that?
I agree with everything that you're saying. And I would go so far as to say that the Chinese government broke my grandmother's mind. I do very much believe that. And I think you're right that a lot of why this book was so hard for me was because I felt that deep sense of duty and that thread to carry forward the role of a journalist. And session just ended yesterday. So I think both of us need some time to just be with our thoughts and gather things for our next move. But the question of how do I now use this extraordinary skeleton key of winning a Pulitzer Prize to act in a way that is in accordance with my duty? Yeah, I'm going to go be in the backcountry for a bit to just take some me time, but that is definitely going to be first and foremost in my mind as I step back into making after finishing this.
Tessa Hulls, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. Is there any question that you wish people would be asking you that they're not?
At this point, since I'm assuming you have a largely Alaskan audience, I've just been using every time that Alaskans will be listening to say, I'm really looking for the right long-term professional partnerships where what I want to do as a comics journalist is tell the story of this land and this place and the areas that need protecting. And I really want to do that in a way where rather than being the freelancer who parachutes in, I want to be there for the boring meetings. I want to have the whole backstory. And I think identifying a small handful of collaborations who can basically bring me on board as a long-term team member, if it seems like what I do is a good fit, reach out.
Is there like a website? How do they reach out?
Oh gosh, I'm so easy to find online.
Okay.
Yeah.
They'll Google you.
Yeah, just Google me.
And I always ask people at the end to recommend a book. Do you want to recommend that book?
Oh, I'm not sure I'm far enough into it right now. This dementia book, Travelers to Unimaginable Lands. I'm liking it so far, but I just read The Ministry of Time. It's a big hit. It's everywhere. Easy to find.
And it was good.
Oh my gosh. It was perfect. It was exactly what I needed because I think it's really easy to get burned out if you're in a role where people are always telling you you're doing such important work. And so for me, reading something that was delightful.
Kellyanne Bradley?
Yeah.
Is that Kellyanne? Kalaine?
I haven't heard her name pronounced, so I'm not sure.
Kaliane Bradley.
Yes.
The Ministry of Time.
Yeah, I finished it the day before my life changed forever.
Really? And she's British Cambodian, so she's...
Yeah, and she also is somebody where her book, she writes about being read as white presenting. And yeah, I'm probably going to shoot her a message. I'm sure she's also deluged because her book was a huge hit. But yeah, there was a lot of it where she's using this kind of absurd premise of time travel. And I don't want to give anything away, but it's a very smart book that's tackling some really weighty topics, but in a way that brings humor into it, which those are my favorite pieces of work.
And your book, which is a very weighty book in comic book style.
Yeah, and I put as much humor in there as possible.
Yes.
I tried.
It was very good. I, again, cannot thank you enough for being on the show, and I wish you the best of luck in Alaska and everywhere else, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Note, today's episode is the finale of season 4. I will be taking the month of June off, and we'll be back with new episodes for season 5 starting in July. And if you need to contact me, you can email me at rep.andrew.gray@aklag.gov or call our Anchorage office phone number at 907-269-0123.